As Eric Resnicek noted this morning in our welcoming remarks, education finance is perennially a topic for state policymakers, and we expect that this will be the case again when the legislature convenes in January of this year. I'm really thrilled to welcome Dr. Bruce Baker here today from the University of Miami, a renowned K-12 finance researcher, to provide an update on national trends in K-12 finance and share his thoughts on options to create a stronger school financing system here in Nebraska, since this is a perennial topic for policy debate. Dr. Baker is a professor and chair of the Department of Teaching and Learning at the University of Miami, and his primary areas of research include elementary and secondary education finance, state school finance systems, and educational equity. He has advised numerous state legislatures across the country and testified on behalf of plaintiff groups across the country regarding equity and adequacy of public school funding. And he's also very familiar with the region of the Great Plains from having previously taught at the University of Kansas prior to his time in New Jersey and then now in Florida. The session will be moderated by Senator Lynne Walz. We're so thrilled to have you here today. Senator Walz is from Fremont and represents District 15 and chairs the legislature's Education Committee. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bruce Baker and Senator Lynne Walz.
How are we doing? That better? All right, good. We're ready to go. Not only I was at the University of Kansas for 11 years, worked extensively on school funding in Kansas, and including advising legislators, the legislative division post audit in Kansas, and working in the context of all the school finance litigation that went on there. I also actually had been doing during the same period a fair amount of work on litigation that did not go to trial on behalf of OPS, and doing studies of kind of what was going on with TIOSA in the mid 2000s and looking at the disparities that were particularly affecting districts like OPS, Grand Island, Lexington, and others around the state. So I'm kind of familiar a little bit with Nebraska too, although I haven't looked at it much in recent years. I've got a lot of technical stuff on these slides, but I'm going to try to really hone in on some core principles and also point you to some data sources that allow you to kind of explore what's going on in other states. What are some of the disparities? What do they look like in Nebraska and Nebraska districts? I happen to run this thing called schoolfinancedata.org that has a lot of reports and data visualizations and ways to look at your school funding systems based on the core principles that I'm going to lay out here. So I'm going to provide a little bit of background and just kind of a quick look nationally at what the trends are, just so we're kind of clear on where are we at in school finance, because there's a lot of kind of misinformation out there. Then I'm going to talk about what we believe, and we're getting broader consensus on this. What are the central goals, the principles that undergird most state school finance systems, and really then lead to design principles for how we evaluate state school finance systems and how we would go about reforming those state school finance systems, which a lot of it's driven in our analyses by this thing that we call this national education cost model. A lot of the focus today is going to be on shifting our mindset to looking at what are the costs and needs faced by school districts, where the definitions around costs and needs are what does it take for these kids in these settings versus those kids in those settings to achieve a common set of outcome goals. Costs are driven by the outcomes we want to achieve, the goals we expect to attain through our school system. It all starts there. We got to figure out what do we want to get from providing public schooling? What does it cost to get there? And then secondary to that, the next step is how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to structure a fair, equitable, and stable tax policy to get that job done? So we're going to take a look at some information across the states based on our national indicator system. And then I'm going to kind of walk through the steps we've used. Increasingly, we have more and more states actually stepping in to figure out how to set those outcome goals and how to then model the different costs to get to those and build the revenue systems around that. Kansas has actually done this kind of twice over the past few decades, driven by the highest level of empirical evidence, somewhat in the context of judicial orders, but they've been involved in this going back to 2005-06, where they had an outside group from the Maxwell School at Syracuse University come in and estimate a cost model. Same method. In fact, we draw on those methods for ours. And again, by a friend, that was by Bill Duncombe and Johnny Yinger at the time from Syracuse, and more recently by Lori Taylor from Texas A&M, who is one of my frequent co-conspirators in cost analyses. We're doing modeling of the Texas Community College system under the same principles right now. So Kansas is a really great model. And even when I'm on the East Coast, I'm pointing to Kansas as a model for that, because they've done more than anyone in that regard at that technical level. So moving on here, some core principles, basic principle. I was talking to school administrators about an hour ago from Baltimore. Even though having enough money in and of itself does not solve everything, the basic principle is that you've got to have that money as a prerequisite condition to get the job done. Schooling is a human resource intensive endeavor. You got to hire enough good people. You have to have enough of them. You have to have people who are sufficiently qualified. So you got to be paying competitive wages to a sufficient number of people to reach those goals that we hope to reach. We haven't found great technological substitutions for quality people. And it's human resource intensive. It costs to get to those goals. And you got to have the money to get there. It also happens to be the case that those costs vary by setting. I'll reiterate this a number of times. The other thing that's really important that's not on this slide, but is on a coming slide, is if you want to achieve higher goals, it costs more than achieving lower goals. So starting with those goals is really important. Kansas actually faced an interesting dilemma over that, because in the newer cost model they estimated in 2018, they set really high goals in the metrics that they wanted used in the model. And then they found that the cost estimates to getting to those goals were even well beyond their expectations. So they did back off from that a little bit, but it created a really useful conversation that there's a connection between what we want to achieve, the goals we want to attain from our school system, and how much it's going to cost to get there. We can't just tell schools, do more, but we're going to give you less. That doesn't work. So, I have a couple of books out there. I think the one that's more useful for the Nebraska context is the very recent one on the state of Kansas, but I have an earlier book that kind of walks through some of the standard arguments about, claiming that money doesn't matter. We actually have a very rich body of literature now that says that money is certainly important to the quality of schooling. These were some of the standard arguments that are debunked in the 2018 book on educational equality and school finance. And we have a range of different types of studies from the more recent studies by Kirabo Jackson and colleagues from Northwestern that show that infusions of funding led to improved outcomes over time, to a number of state-specific studies that have shown the effects of school finance reforms, even to revisiting the technical issues in the earlier studies that some other authors say showed that money doesn't matter. We look a little more closely and sort out the higher quality studies, we get a different conclusion from that. So there's a vast body of literature that tells us that, yes, money matters. There's also this body of literature that tells us that it costs more to achieve higher outcomes, which by implication suggests that money matters. So, and over time, when we adjust the dollar value, the current spending that's gone into public schools over time for the changing costs of labor, maintenance of labor quality, it's pretty flat. The interesting twist is that, we've generally over the long haul increased the quantity of teachers, but we've not paid attention to the competitiveness of their wages. So teacher wage competitiveness has slid relative to non-teachers over time, but we scaled up the quantity. The Great Recession hit and that dipped. It affected most states more than it affected Nebraska. In fact, that's one of the virtues of the heavy reliance on the property tax. It's not as volatile, but it has its other issues. So that's just a little backdrop, and I'm going to see if I can speed us through a number of other issues here, and then we'll get some kind of rich conversation. But the theme, again, is that we got to focus on the goals that we want to achieve. And with those goals come costs to achieve those goals. Those costs vary by the student population that you intend to serve that needs to get to those goals. They vary by the location. Labor costs in one place are more than they are in others. And economies of scale is a major factor, certainly affecting the costs in small, remote, rural districts in Northwest Nebraska. that'll up your cost 2 to 3 times the base cost just to get to the same outcome goals because of the underlying staffing ratios that are needed simply to run a school that provides the programs and services necessary. So this is, kind of reiterating the same, but in the context of a state school finance formula. The goal of a state school finance formula is to provide equal opportunity for all kids to achieve whatever these common outcome goals are. Again, it starts with the goal. The costs vary by the kids and the setting, and the costs vary by the outcomes we want to achieve. This isn't something that's just out of the log of kind of Bruce Baker's theories and thoughts. It is, the basis of the chapter in the handbook. There's actually a handbook on education finance, and it's actually thick, which is just amazing. There are many of us who write about these topics. The handbook chapter on conceptions of equity and adequacy lays it out this way, and other chapters build on this as a concept. So it is really a growing consensus of the field, as are the methods we use to do these estimates. The steps in the process, again, are we set the spending targets to meet those outcomes, and then we figure out how to design a fair tax and revenue system to achieve those spending targets for each district in the state. And fairness, falls in terms of, well, what proportion, I saw the graphs over there, what's the proportion of income that taxpayers in different income brackets are paying in combined state and local taxes. That's one dimension of it. Another dimension of having a good tax system is mitigating volatility or obtaining stability, having a balanced portfolio. I do hear a lot of people say, well, we could fix all this by just having a progressive income tax and fully funding education from that. The big problem with that is the incredible volatility of income tax revenues. And for example, in states, when we look at states that have income taxes as the primary kind of source of their revenues for their general funds, and we see that, and those are the states where a lot, like in New Jersey, the highest poverty, lowest wealth districts get the vast majority of their funding through state aid, and the wealthiest kind of suburban enclaves get most of their money from their local property taxes. When recessions hit, those districts that are getting 80% of their money from state aid that's derived from income tax are seeing huge fluctuations, which dramatically affects planning and budgeting, which then affects the efficiency with which they can operate. So we got to be careful in how we balance the revenue portfolio and how that revenue portfolio balances across districts and taxpayers. So, a hypothetical school finance formula would probably look something like this if we kind of conflate, higher poverty and lower wealth, which gets confusing in states with vast kind of rural ag economies. We get some other kind of funky overlays, which don't, fit with this framework. But we would see that, local revenue would be raised, in a larger proportion in these higher wealth districts, which are probably serving a lower need, lower cost target population. And then we'd have those districts that are higher in need, higher in cost, that would be much more dependent on state aid. I'm trying to come up with alternative formulas and work with states on ways to better balance the internal revenue balance across these. But the cost targets for those high poverty districts are going to be much higher. They're also going to get a slightly bigger chunk of federal aid, more so with, pandemic response aid, but in regular times, that's been more like a 10 to 15% share, not a huge chunk. So again, reiterating a couple of points before. So what we do, one of the things we do, and this is where we're going to really start diving into pictures and numbers, and Nebraska on average looks pretty good. We, as a team of statistical geeks working with a think tank in DC, take data on 13,000 the 13,000 or so school districts in the country. And we take it over 11 years, actually 2009 to 2019. And we have all the information about the students they serve, the demographics, whether they're a small remote rural district as well, whether they have more children in poverty, more English language learners, more children with disabilities. We take all these data and we have their outcome data. There's a Stanford Education Data Archive constructed by this guy, Sean Reardon, and his colleagues, where they actually take the state assessment data and they've statistically adjusted it to a common scale that aligns with the National Assessment of Educational Progress. So we have these equated outcome measures for reading and math for every district in the country from grades 3 through 8. We got what they get in outcomes. We've got their spending data. We've got all this other stuff about these districts. And we can build a statistical model that helps us understand what level of spending is associated with getting what level of outcomes under all these different circumstances. It's like building a crazy forecasting model with a whole bunch of data. It's built on a technique that's actually been used in states with state level data for a number of years. It's the same method that was used in Kansas in 2006 and in 2018 to advise their legislature, this kind of statistical modeling approach. And we take this model and just to kind of have a benchmark, we say, well, using this model, what does the model predict should be the per pupil cost or spending in every district in the country if we wanted that district to be able to achieve national average outcomes? So we just set it to an outcome that's commonly achieved. What's the cost to achieve national average outcomes? And then we can compare their existing spending to the spending we predict they need to achieve that common outcome goal. It always starts with the common outcome goal. You may decide in setting policy here, we want better than national average outcomes. Most places, I think, would decide that. Because national average outcomes are a mix of what's derived from places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia and Tennessee, as well as very high performing states like Massachusetts and New Jersey. So your own state's outcome decisions should be driven by your own state's kind of policymakers and preferences, but this is just to kind of benchmark. Now, on the right-hand side, we have what are the actual outcomes, the over and unders against national averages, and the deep purples are areas where the actual outcomes in reading and math are well below national averages, and the brighter greens are the areas where the outcomes are higher than the national averages. In the other map, the deep reds are areas where the spending is much less than needed to achieve national average outcomes. The other thing we control for in here is if the district operated at average efficiency. We don't want to, just kind of give in to saying, well, some of these we'll just let some districts do this less efficiently. Holding efficiency constant, how does the actual spending in these districts compare to what is needed to achieve a common set of outcomes? And we see vast swaths of red across the South, the deepest reds actually in the Southwest in places like Arizona. In advocacy meetings, I'm often have people like to step up and say, our state has the worst school finance formula, or we're the least well-funded. And if it's a national audience, I'm always like, well, where are the people from Arizona? Because they're actually the state with the least well-funded education system by most of our metrics, including this one. But we can also, even just visually here, see that where the funding is more adequate, the outcomes are more adequate. There are many dimensions to this. One is that you've got a wealthier, more affluent, more educated population on average in Massachusetts. The cost to get them to national average outcomes, therefore, is lower, right? It's not that expensive to raise the outcomes in a place where the student population and their families are well educated and well off. It's much costlier in Alabama or Mississippi. Sadly, it's much costlier in those places that also happen to, on average, spend the least. That's why the gaps are so huge. So this is kind of our starting point for where we go, and that's why I spent so much time on this one, is for where we go from here. If we put this into people who follow my stuff know that I love these scatter plots, which are kind of hard maybe to dig into. But the idea here is that we're looking at the spending relative to the cost to achieve the outcome goal on the horizontal dimension and the actual outcomes on the vertical dimension. And as you move further to the right, this is every district in the country in, I think, 2019. As you move further to the right, those are districts with more adequate funding. As you move further to the right, their outcomes are also going up. The more adequate the funding, the more adequate the outcomes. But there's some scatter there, and that does give us opportunity to explore, well, what's going on in some of these ones that are on the outer edges. Did we miss something in the model? Do we just have a bad prediction for them? Or are they actually doing something strangely different? But here we can also pull out states and see that, Massachusetts, most districts and kids in Massachusetts are in the upper right. Most districts and kids in Arizona are in the lower left. But even within a state, there's some scatter. And we'll take a look at Nebraska in a little bit here. And we have on this schoolfinancedata.org, you can also look at these. There was an article done by a reporter from Missouri that did some Missouri versus Kansas comparisons using these data viz. It was out of Kansas City, the Kansas City Beacon, some new paper there. But we can see if we look even by the kind of breaking districts in the state into quintiles, 20% of districts, the highest poverty to lowest poverty. We can see that, in some states, most of the quintiles, have funding at or above what would be the cost target to achieve national average outcomes. But in other states, Massachusetts versus Arizona, where even the lowest poverty districts barely have what would be needed to achieve national average outcomes. The other thing that we find in a lot of our data is that that the percent of a state's economy that they put up to fund their schools ends up actually being strongly related to this. So these are state policy choices. The choice to fund your schools inadequately has, in fact, in Arizona and other places, been a choice to fund the schools inadequately. Okay, so I just want to, so there's our picture of our cost model. I'm not going to harp on that much. Let's see where why don't I just skip over that whole section and take us further into just some examples and then some Nebraska work. Let's see. So again, this schoolfinancedata.org is, hopefully some of you will have some fun playing with it. You'll, if you're interested in exploring the education policy stuff a little more, you can drop me some emails and I can point you in some directions. But there are a couple of tools in particular that I like to use. We can look at individual states in here. Like we can take a look at it and we can then kind of dig out individual districts. This is what the state of Pennsylvania looks like, right? Where again, for each district in the state, we have a predicted cost to achieve national average outcomes, and we have their actual outcomes. So we have districts way up in the upper right that are districts that spend well more than they need to achieve national average outcomes, and districts in the lower left that have significant gaps to achieve those outcomes. And we see that Philadelphia here is in the lower left. In fact, Philadelphia's immediate neighbor to the west, a district called Lower Merion School District, is way up in the upper right. Two districts right next to each other. And even if we compared just their straight up nominal spending without looking at it through this lens, Lower Merion spends significantly more than Philadelphia, but Lower Merion serves a population that is substantially less needy, less costly to get to any common cost target. And some highlight, and I'll make these slides available for sharing. Again, the idea is that you can use these data visualizations to explore these disparities within any state. You can look at the bar graphs to look at them at a more aggregate level of what's going on by quintile by poverty. But we have a number of, like, this is city of Chicago in Illinois also falls in the lower left, like Philly. Philly and Chicago are two of the least well-funded major urban districts in the country. New York City falls right around the intercept here, that it has roughly what's needed to achieve national average outcomes and has outcomes roughly commensurate with that on the most recent year of data. And Boston falls right around that same space, but Philly and Chicago are deep in the lower left corner. But the other thing that people start to see when they're looking at their states is that even though they think of Chicago as that very poorly funded district, look at how many districts are down to the lower left of Chicago. Chicago is very poorly funded, but there are always these districts that are left out and forgotten, which are often what I've written about in a lot of my work are they're like the second cities of school finance. And in many, many cases, they're predominantly Latino second cities, outlying places like Lexington and Grand Island, or Dodge City, Kansas, or in Pennsylvania, places like Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and in Connecticut, places like Bridgeport, Waterbury, and New Britain, right? There are all these outlying, predominantly Latinx second cities. And in fact, if you even like Google that phrase, you'll find these articles I've done on school finance on that get overlooked. And in Illinois, one of the ones that's down to the further is Waukegan, north of Chicago, a predominantly Latino district that's just overlooked in this process. It's a big issue across many states that, as poorly funded as some of the major cities are, there are others who are in much poorer shape, in part because of the way the political power dynamic plays out in trying to remedy these things. Again, a lot of this comes down to the effort that a state puts up. And I'm going to do a little jumping. And the other thing is, looking across all of our indicators, we see that the percent of a state's economic capacity it allocates to solving these problems is strongly related to these problems, the adequacy of the funding, the overall level of the funding. It's also related to the competitiveness of teacher wages. You go back to that early slide that shows we've had this backslide for decades of comparing teacher wages at the same education level, and in my analysis, same education level and the same age against non-teachers in the same labor market. And teacher wages have become less and less competitive over time. That's also reasonably related to the amount of effort a state's putting up to fund its schools. What percent of its economic capacity, where we're measuring that capacity either by gross state product or by aggregate personal income. The effort a state puts up matters. But I don't know that, Nebraska has been, too out of line on its aggregate effort. It's just that most of that effort has been shifted entirely onto the locals. So now some pictures of Nebraska on these same dimensions. The funding gaps by poverty quintile, and Nebraska's average funding level has been pretty high. Putting it into these bars like this is deceptive, though, because it's scattered all over the place within each bar. And it's scattered all over the place within each bar because of that dependence on the local property taxes, because of what goes on in the small rural districts versus the larger districts, and so on. And I think actually in these graphs, it may be that OPS falls into the second, not the top category on poverty, which is why the bars pop the way they do. That the second to highest, the high poverty category, is the one that's underfunded relative to cost targets, because OPS, as you'll see in future graphs, is underfunded relative to cost targets. But Nebraska, on average, the average funding level is pretty high. The average outcomes are pretty high. You go back to those maps, a really fun thing to look at is the fact that Missouri, you got Missouri and even Colorado, which is a politically more purple state, and Oklahoma are deep in the red on deficits and low on outcomes. Kansas looks pretty good, and Nebraska on average even looks a little better than Kansas. So they really, Wyoming is its own beast out there with very high funding per pupil driven by a number of factors from the past, which we'll have to set aside for the day. Okay. So moving on from here, if we look at those scatter plots with Nebraska, we also see that, a lot of Nebraska is in the upper right. Relative to national average outcomes, if we set a low enough bar, anyone can look good, right? If we set a low enough bar, it doesn't cost much to get there. So the conversation within Nebraska should really be about what's the bar we want to set. How would that move? Basically, it would move those red line. It would move the red line that is vertical to the right and move the red line that is horizontal upward if we set a higher outcome. What we can see here is that, the spending gaps and outcome gaps in Nebraska are kind of scattered all over the place. Our cost model suggests that the per pupil costs in Omaha in particular are significantly higher than its current spending level, that the policies, TIOSA and its variations and the tax caps and dependence on it has not still over time served OPS very well in bringing it even to that intercept of having enough to achieve national average outcomes in doing so. But we also see that relative to its funding gap, its outcome gap is what we would expect. That it would be unfair of us to say to OPS, just looking at their dollar amount spending, OPS, what are you doing wrong? Your outcomes are lower than almost every other district out here. But if you put it in this context, their outcomes are right in line with the funding gap we've handed them. That if we fit the line to the pattern here, we'd find that the outcome gap and the funding gap are in line. And there's some scatter around that. I get less confident in making judgments about, what might be going on with one of these tiny districts down in the lower right. Maybe there is a unique feature to them or something that, you only had a very small number of test takers in a given year, even summing the kids between grades 3 and 8. So weird stuff can go on in small samples of data in tiny districts. More confident in what's going on in the estimates for the bigger districts. But even then, it gets pretty scattered in the upper right corner. And we got a lot of districts that do appear to have lower than expected outcomes given what they spend. The other thing that and this is kind of a low bar versus high bar comparison, where the graph on the left is what are the actual current spending versus the cost target based on low bar, national average outcomes. And we can see in most cases that the current spending, the green circle for a district from lowest to highest poverty, the green circles for most districts in the graph on the left are higher than the red triangles. The districts are spending more than they would need to achieve national average outcomes, and they're achieving more than national average outcomes. That's the previous graph, the ones in the upper right. What if we shoot for Massachusetts average outcomes? We want a higher outcome. If we want to compete with Massachusetts and New Jersey, that's the graph on the right. And now we see that, yeah, there are a few districts way down in the lowest poverty districts where the spending is a little bit above what would be needed to achieve the average outcomes in Massachusetts. But as we move further to the right, those cost targets go way up to shoot for a higher outcome. We're now talking about, instead of shooting for just between 10 and 20,000, we're now talking about getting up over $20,000 per pupil in places like OPS, and getting even toward 25 or so to hit that higher cost target. And OPS, it is a large urban district with significant poverty in the context of Nebraska, but by comparison to other places, it's not an incredibly high cost district. Just more pictures, and OPS position has not really changed. The graph on the right is OPS relative adequacy of funding over the last, like 2009 to 2019, really didn't change much. And it's just kind of sat there in the lower left corner. Some Kansas and Nebraska comparisons here is that Nebraska seems to have relatively adequate funding and puts up relatively average effort. You're not one of the horrible, you're not Arizona. You got a nice starting point. You got a heavy reliance on the property tax, which creates some noise and irregularity and inequity. But the shift, the mindset shift here has to be on outcome goals and cost targets, and then using good empirical evidence to drive that. So again, Nebraska, this is the book on Kansas, which may provide some insights on that. And it talks, it's kind of stories about the people and the places and stuff, and how this all played out from a storyline perspective. But the rigorous evidence, the constitutional structure and all that really drove Kansas to do things that no other state has done in adopting this same conceptual framework and using the most rigorous empirical analysis to drive it. So it's, again, like when I'm in Jersey or if I'm in California talking, I'm still referring to Kansas. This is a fun thing. We, in a national formula, I just threw this in randomly. In a national formula we created, we built out an index because we had to, and this is a report you may want to look at too. We built out an index that would try to create a predicted value for what the state and local share split should be for every district in the country within their state context. So we built out like a lot of states in their funding formulas, they'll start with the cost target, then they'll figure out what's the state and local split need to be to get to that target. So they'll come up with some index that takes into account wealth and income and other factors, so that higher wealth, higher income districts pay a larger share toward the cost. And so we created a national index for that. And we find in almost every state that the existing differences in local revenue are aligned with our national index in a positive and logical way. In almost every state, except, among a few others, Nebraska. Right. What's in this graph, which is kind of funky, is that, if you look at New Jersey, the districts that are contributing greater local revenue per pupil are the districts that by our index should be contributing greater local revenues per pupil. But because they are wealthier, they have higher income, they have higher housing values, they have a higher income to poverty ratio. They're higher on all these index measures that we throw into our aggregate index. Turns out the wealthiest districts in New Jersey are so wealthy they can't, if they did contribute, as much as our model predicts, they'd be, contributing $35,000 per pupil in local revenue. That might be more than they even need. So they don't go there. And we do have a group of large districts that kind of fall off the line to the lower right. Those are districts that were party to the litigation in New Jersey during a period where the state was forced to fully fund whatever they needed or wanted. without regard for their local contribution. So they just held back local contribution. So that's why they fall to, and even in Kansas, the line is mostly, logically, gradually drifting upward. Districts that our model estimates should be contributing more are. In Nebraska, the overall pattern goes the opposite direction. But I will point out there's some underlying patterns. The larger districts in Nebraska create a floor in this picture that tilts in the right direction, kind of like Kansas. And then it's that scatter among the small rural districts that are really providing much higher local revenue per pupil on their own backs than our model would predict they should be. So there does appear to be some real kind of pressure on the local revenue per pupil in the small rural districts. There's an underlying pattern, which is kind of logical, but Nebraska is one of our only states in our model that goes the wrong direction on this index. We tie a lot of it in another report back to racial segregation issues. Certainly the Omaha area, redlining, housing, and all that really drove a lot of the structure of the housing values and property tax revenues that could be derived between OPS and its neighbors, which then fuels some of the disparity that's got to be corrected by the state aid formula. That was a presentation I did about an hour ago to some folks in Baltimore. So, when we go through this process with state legislatures, we walk them through this whole, and we've had the real pleasure lately. More legislators, even though they're not changing their policies substantially, are having these conversations around setting outcome goals and doing rigorous analysis to estimate the costs. And we worked with Vermont to recalibrate their weighting system for costs and needs. We developed models for New Hampshire. We're consulting with Delaware, and I'm in the process of doing work for the state of Virginia along these same lines. And this is a flurry of activity that really didn't exist until recently. So we're and it's around the core principles that I'm advocating here. Again, reiterating, in the past, there were people who did these approaches where in fact, there was a study done in Nebraska in the early 2000s where groups went around and kind of tallied the resources that would be needed in this type of school or that type of school. It was done by Augenblick, Palatian Associates from Colorado. On the one hand, we find that approach to be a pretty burdensome approach to getting to the numbers. On the other hand, it invariably understates the additional needs in high need settings and overstates the baseline costs in low need settings. It's just statistical reality. When we compare the estimates, the cost model that really teases out those differences in costs based on the realities that kids face, the existing data, find that there are much sharper gradients in the cost to get high poverty settings to common outcome goals. And in fact, that it might be particularly low cost to get to those outcomes in very low need settings. Those approaches, everyone more or less ends up getting mild gradients of difference because they're kind of built around this consensus building approach of just setting a high minimum of, well, every school needs this, and then these schools only need marginally more. It's just not rooted in reality. It's not consistent with the subsequent analyses we've done. So I do have a number of slides that kind of pick at that a little bit. And again, I'll let these slides kind of go around so we can get some conversation going on. So what it looks like in Maryland, if you look at the actual spending versus the models estimated by that approach versus a cost model, they went through all these processes and found that, well, it just doesn't cost much more in Baltimore City than its very affluent suburban neighbor next door. Simply not true. It's impossible to conceive. And so our cost model suggests, no, it actually costs a lot more if you want to get those outcomes in Baltimore. Illinois has a new formula built on that approach of here's what a basic school needs, and it needs slightly more if it's got more needy kids. We've compared that and found the same as we found in the Maryland comparison. So just to reiterate what we try to do with states when working on this, and the consensus building process should really be around the outcome goal setting. It's a level of outcomes and it's a depth and breadth of outcomes. Unfortunately, the national models we're looking at here are all about predicting the costs associated with grade 3 through 8 math scores. You throw graduation rates, succeeding on a number of other metrics. We're doing cost modeling for the community college system in Texas based on persistence and completion rates across different types of programs for different types of students. We can enrich those outcome measures in the state policy discussion, that the conversation always starts there, that it's about goal setting. That's where the consensus has to be built. From there, we jump to finding the best data and applying the best empirical methods to estimate the costs of those consensus outcomes. There's not as much political consensus building around the statistical model. The statistical model has to meet kind of features of rigor and quality. The consensus building is around the outcome goals. And then the next trick, and we've really been working on this with state legislatures to simplify, these cost models can become really complicated. But we can actually boil them down to your typical kind of weighted school funding formula. A lot of school funding formulas have a base level of funding and have weights and adjustments on them for certain student populations, and often the very same student populations that do correctly predict those costs. A lot of the time, if you've got a formula structure that already includes those features, you can take your predictions from the cost model and actually just kind of adjust the levers in the existing formula until you get closer and closer to the cost model. Right? Or you can, do any number of other approaches that will tell you, and what should we weight and how much to get to those cost targets. So it's not about using the cost model itself as the new policy. It's about using the cost model to bend the existing policy in the right direction. And I always say, when I'm working with policymakers or speaking to broader audiences, the goal in all of this is to lead to school finance policy that is less bad than it might otherwise be. We try to set modest goals here. And that is, can we get decent empirical evidence in there to bend it in the right direction? Can we start with the goals, recognize that goals have costs associated with them, and figure out those costs and bend policy toward those costs so that all kids have equal opportunity to achieve these common outcomes? And I can just kind of leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, I have to say how much I appreciate the fact that you're shifting the focus from funding needs to funding outcomes and funding goals. I appreciate that very much. So I have a couple questions for you. First of all, we have some very small districts in Nebraska, less than 100 students in some, as well as some large districts in our cities. How should we be thinking about the fiscal effort of each of our districts when the student populations they are serving are so different?
So again, I think that fits so nicely within our framework, because in our step one, when we estimate the per pupil costs, it's going to take into account both that they are small and who they serve. And you're probably going to find a district with fewer than 100 kids is going to have a cost estimate that's maybe 2.5 times the per pupil cost of your kind of average size, or a district with 2,000 or more students of an average mix. So they've got a much higher cost. Of course, the next question is, how are we going to set up the split between what percent of that cost they should pay for locally versus what percent they should get from the state, such that the burden on the taxpayers in that local community is fair. So there are a whole other set of loaded assumptions about what do we mean by fair in that context. But I do think one of the reasonable metrics on that is even to view the property taxation, or even the sum of all the state and local taxation faced by those citizens, as in relation to their income, like you see in these kind of typical kind of graphs. Looking across different effort metrics, we can, as a starting point, we can say that, based on like our wealth and income index, which maybe I'll pull it out and look at, based on our wealth and income index, we predict that community should contribute 23% of their total cost. What I'm concerned with, and that's a starting point, my concern is if their cost is really high, even 23% of that cost may be an undue burden on some of these communities. So it might have to be further adjusted. But it's step one, figure out their costs. It's going to be really high for less than 100. That's where it really spikes. And then start figuring out how do we fund it so that we don't just totally squeeze these taxpayers in this community. I hope that's sufficient.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. What should the state's role be in making sure there's a level playing field financially for all of our districts?
So for, again, going back to my definition of level playing field is sufficient money to achieve the common outcomes. That's where the level is, not on the level on the, it's not level dollars, it's dollars to achieve common outcomes. And then given what the local communities can contribute fairly, the state needs to be able to provide sufficient aid to close that gap. The state aid has to be sufficient to bring those, all districts to those cost targets. And that's one area where Nebraska has fallen short. The average amount of money in the system is pretty good. A lot of it's local, and that leaves behind districts that need more state aid to really get to the cost targets, like OPS and some others.
Thank you. What are the benefits and pitfalls of foundation aid in a school finance formula?
Well, so like a foundation aid formula, like a lot of states use, we set that baseline funding, right? Now, absent any real, if we don't ever get to the point of talking about the outcomes we need to achieve and the costs and different costs to get to those outcomes, then everything that gets added on to that base funding is a matter of purely political deliberation without conceptual framework or empirical guidance. So where we set the foundation level of funding is probably just based on the budget constraint. How much money do we have divided by how many kids? Not based on what do we want to achieve. And then B, how much we put into a weight on English language learners or low income children is similarly derived from the budget constraint in relation to the foundation, and purely political deliberation without keeping in mind, and with these kids, how much more does it cost to achieve to get to the to get to those same outcomes? So yeah, if we just kind of back out the foundation from budget constraint every time and let everything beyond that be a purely political deliberation, we aren't going to converge. We're going to see what we see in the scatter plots for Nebraska. And we're going to see that it hasn't changed in 10 years because we haven't changed the conversation.
And what are some innovative ways for us to address poverty in the school finance formula?
Provide enough funding to offset the negative effects.
Thank you.
I'm not using one for short answer.
Can you just, I'm going to go not off the question. This is a different question, but can you talk just a little bit more about how a state comes together to figure out what their goals and their outcomes are for education?
Interestingly, in this process, that's a part of the process that I usually don't direct. My colleague Jesse Levin from the American Institutes for Research, they do these kind of with constituent groups. They will do these focus group activities on kind of really setting out the broad goals and principles, and then figuring out what measures and metrics might be appropriate to use. And it really should be a thoughtful, deep conversation about, what's the purpose of our public schooling system, and how do these, like, we've kind of gotten into this system of just kind of, in fact, Nebraska was one of the last on this band, adopting standardized tests to use in an accountability system. We just do these things year after year. We have cut scores as to what counts as proficient and not, and we just do it. We don't really talk about what it means and how it relates to the bigger goals. So there are in American Institutes for Research, in a study they did for New Mexico and other, they do these consensus building activities among policymakers, usually subcommittees, as well as other constituent groups around the state, and try to compile that to achieve some kind of guidance on what measures should be used. Kansas, in their most recent iteration, really they jumped quickly to what are the cut scores and points used by the State Board of Ed, and we're just going to throw those into the model, and they got a result that shocked them. And it made the headlines in the Kansas City Star how much more it was going to cost them based on it. So yeah, it's the starting point. It's got to be a rich conversation, and I think we got to hand it to
Yep.
the audience.
Time for some audience questions.
Hi there, I'm Renee Fry. I've followed your work for a long time, and I really wish that the former executive director of Open Sky Policy Institute had brought you in sooner. So,
I was playing around in Nebraska in the mid 2000s, but on the litigation side.
so Connie Kanoki with Open Sky Policy Institute had done some looking at similarly sized districts that have very different levels of ELL and poverty. And it's found that the funding, per pupil funding, is about the same, even though the funding formula does have allowances for ELL and for poverty. And so it's just not going far enough.
It's not enough and counterbalanced by other factors, which is really common across states.
And so again, you've talked about process and goals and that sort of thing. Are having those levers, ELL and poverty, pretty typical for other states that they just need to be weighted more? Or are there other ways that states are looking at those factors?
So there are a couple of things. Those are right. Those are levers on the system that certainly need to exist. In most states, the magnitude put on those is not enough to drive enough money. But the other thing that happens is states, because what costs more or less ends up not being driven by conceptions and empirical models, but by what policymakers can step up and argue costs more. They get offset by counterbalancing factors. Like in Kansas, the weight on kids in brand new facilities is greater than the sum of the weights on poverty and ELL, or was for a number of years. And which districts had kids in new facilities? So if you look just in the Kansas City metro, that weight on the outlying suburbs more than offset, counterbalanced the weight on ELL and poverty in Kansas City, Kansas, and Turner. And then on top of that, they threw in an adjustment to compensate teachers for living or working in districts with high-priced housing. So they actually put in an adjustment for the districts with high. So when it's purely a matter of political debate, what costs more, you get that kind of thing, in addition to the fact that sometimes the overall formula is just set so low that all the locals around it raise more than the formula would provide them. Everything counterbalances that unless you provide enough money and aggressive enough weighting to really get the job done. And you got to get rid of that. I have a whole separate report on those stealth inequalities. All these different, Texas did it through tax relief aid. New York did it through tax relief aid, giving tax relief to wealthy communities that then went and spent more and more, offsetting any weighting. Weight's got to be big enough, and you got to not have those offsetting factors in there that simply don't make sense from a cost standpoint.
You talk about the outcomes of students as opposed to, the offsets that you have and the political things that can happen in a formula. If you look at the outcomes, that's where you get to the true cost.
Yeah, this really comes from great work done by a guy who passed a number of years ago, but before he passed, he'd done some really nice stuff on Nebraska that never really got out there, including a cost model of Nebraska districts in the mid 2000s. A guy named Bill Duncombe, where he said, education costs, cost indices and outcomes, you can't have one without the other. When you're talking about the cost of something, it's the cost of some particular thing of a given level of, of a given quantity and quality. Right, that different automobiles, different other products have different costs associated, ideally with quality, and that we have to have some outcome goal in mind if we want to even think about costs. And right, once we have that conceptual framework, that then negates some of these other things that might be argued as cost factors, right? Like high-priced houses. Well, the districts with higher-priced houses, in fact, have lower costs to achieve common outcomes, not higher costs. Right. So, once you have the right conceptual framework guiding your conversation, a lot more flows from there in logical and equitable manner, including the empirical. A lot of this actually comes out of internal conversations in the Nebraska litigation, and the legal team on that was David Peterson, Elizabeth Einen Kokoda, and Jill Robb Ackerman, were really thought leaders behind a lot of this in conversations we had that just informed how I wrote everything after that point in time.
In the example of Kansas, they also have a large agricultural element to their state. I think we have more space, but I'm wondering what were some of the ways that was captured as a lever in Kansas or in other states that we're making sure that we're adequately recognizing the challenges in the rural communities as well.
In Kansas in 1992, when they adopted a new formula, it was actually built on a number of formulas before that. It turned out that, and there was a huge split between the rural communities in terms of their taxable wealth, because you had some kind of oil and natural gas communities and community with a hydro plant that all of a sudden was they're just going to have to pay their full ride and be capped on what they could even raise beyond that. But on average, Kansas first cut at a new formula under this kind of cost-based design ended up estimating very high per pupil costs for the tiny rural districts, and then setting a flat rate of what they would pay in taxes in their contribution and giving state aid for the rest. So any lower wealth, small rural outlying Kansas town got a lot more state aid in that first cut. And it really kept you can see in those kind of tax, it kept the tiny rural communities' local revenue in Kansas down much lower than what's being asked of the Western Nebraska districts. They got a lot more state aid, which state aid and tax relief are flip sides of the same coin also. State aid is what provides you the opportunity to spend what you need without taxing yourself to death. So locally.
Hi, I lived in Arizona during the period after 2008. And over the next couple of years, they cut state aid upward of like 28%, and they never recovered from it.
No, they didn't.
So the question I have, I guess, is that when you look at states like Arizona and states like Massachusetts, the big debate here is, how much is property tax and how much is state aid? And like in a place like Massachusetts that does so well, I mean, what's their split of property tax to state aid? Where's the money coming from?
Theirs is a more even split, but Massachusetts is still fairly high on property tax. New Jersey is still fairly high on property tax. They're both higher than Kansas is on the property tax share. And again, it's not about, and this is something we show in other work, is it's not that necessarily having a higher percent from property tax leads to a less equitable system, because it depends on how progressively you allocate the state aid. Right. And Massachusetts and New Jersey have much more disparity in their taxable wealth across communities than Nebraska or Kansas too. I mean, the very high wealth communities in Massachusetts and New Jersey on taxable property wealth are really high wealth. So they have huge disparity in their local taxing capacity, more so than Kansas or Nebraska, and they have fairly high percent coming from local, but the state aid is aggressively targeted such that it counterbalances that better than it does in Nebraska, but Kansas is about on par with them on the targeting. So it's not, and having property tax share be relatively high also has the benefits of stability, right? Volatility is significantly reduced by having those property taxes in there. And I'm working with some of those other states on creative ways they might split out the commercial industrial tax base to share revenues off commercial industrial, and then have the res tax base drive the local revenue. So there are some other solutions that authors have written about since the 70s. Helen Sunny Ladd wrote about that work in the 1970s.
Thank you, Dr. Baker and Senator Walz. I've got one more question, I think, before we wrap up, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about special education funding and where that might factor into cost estimates and how we think about adequate funding. It's a topic of conversation here in Nebraska.
Yes, it certainly is and always is. And special education funding is particularly complicated. Now, we do have ways within our modeling context to account for the proportions of the population that have disabilities. Typically, those are split into two. We like to at least have the data to split that into two groups: those who are high incidence and relatively low in severity of disability, and those kids who are mild SLD and BD, and now the growing other health impairment now includes ADHD. So mild SLD, BD, and OHI, who are also kids who on average are participating in the standard outcome metrics more so. And they are, maybe if you have 15 or 16% of kids who qualify for special education, they are like 12 to 14%. They're the vast majority. So that group can be included in the cost modeling to predict the margins of additional costs as those populations are larger or smaller in some settings than other, to be just driven into the same formula. It is a much more difficult conversation to get into about when we deal with the more severe disabilities. We almost have to have an entirely separate conversation about the outcomes we desire, because they can't be measured on the same scales and with the same goals. And again, there I would turn you to a lot of the work from the folks, Mike Waymeyer and folks down at the University of Kansas who talk about self-determination outcomes and really just have a separate program to fully fund those needs of the more severe disabilities that is outside of and separate from that mild SLD, BD, and OHI group that can be embedded in our cost models because they do show up on the same outcome metrics.
All right, thank you. So I would just like to thank you, Dr. Baker, and also Senator Walz. Thank you so much for being here and helping to guide this conversation. I think you've given us a tremendous amount of food for thought, so thank you. And with that, we've reached the end of our program. So I want to thank you all so much for being here with us in person today for this conversation. We are going to be making a recording of the symposium available online. And for those of you who are interested in Dr. Baker's slides, I think we can also, I think we can make them available. So thank you again for being here, and please stay in touch with us for other Open Sky sponsored events. Thank you.